There won't be prizes for guessing which museums we're in, but we can talk about it at the end if you want. So understanding how audiences are imagined, constituted, and shift, and are active in this work that they do is no mean feat, especially in relation to the equally complex and shifting notions of public science, education, and engagement that we have today. But in societies like ours, where science plays really important roles, it's embedded in people's lives in ways that questions about who can access science, laugh at it, enjoy it, or question it become really crucial. And this is where I think, and I'm going to assume we might all think in this kind of a room, that places like natural history museums, zoos and botanic gardens, or aquaria might come in. Research suggests these spaces offer really valuable learning experiences for their visitors. But much of that research is carried out with people who are already in the system, leaving few clues for the rest of us about people who aren't already visitors or might never think to visit these spaces, might find those experiences, might find those contents and collections, might find those kinds of ways of being. So today I'm going to talk through some data from a project with people who all lived in central London with its amazingly rich array of resources right on their doorstep, but never used any kind of public science stuff in their lives. This stuff was seen as not for them. They didn't think they were welcome. They didn't do it. So I apologize. There's going to be a few research colleagues in the room who've already heard all of this stuff, probably at least 10,000 times. What I think is useful about talking about this project again today is that if we're talking about natural history museums and audiences, I'm thinking about fleshing out that imagined audience, both who we imagine the audience to be and who we might implicitly imagine a non-audience to be, who we don't design for, who we don't think about, and what the implications of the way our imagined audience comes out in our design work or in our programming, what those implications are for the less obvious non-audience. And what I hope to be able to show you today is some research that shows about negative expectations being met in practice. So in the blurb, it's not the happy story we might want. But I'm going to go through some implications at the end, I think, where we could improve things. And I'm going to leave it to the questions, hopefully, for you guys to help me make the links to the stuff that I've missed already earlier on today. So, to recap, how do we imagine our visitors? How can using equity and social justice as lenses for understanding non-visitors help us? And then this whistle-stop tour through a project. And I'm looking at that big clock at the back, and Brad, so I'm going to go fast. So this is the study. It was a qualitative study with an ethnographic approach. And there were 4 community groups in southeast London, but they were all in central London. So there's a Sierra Leonean group, an Asian group, a Somali group, and a Latin American group. And what's important from this perspective is that they're grassroots groups. They're not service-providing groups grouped together around a school or a refugee center. They've come together by themselves. And they do their own stuff. So I kind of piggybacked for 2 years on their things, going to festivals and dances and random meetings and weddings and all this stuff. That's the main data set, or many things. And what I'm going to concentrate on today are the 4 accompanied visits to STEM sites. And they chose what they wanted to do. So it wasn't me saying, oh, I really think we should do this. So it's quite interesting that so many of them chose natural history sites. Now, this is the framework that I'm using at the moment to understand it all, and I'm going to explain it, and you can just tell me at the end if you don't think it's useful or amazingly badly explained. But I'm quite liking it, so I'm going to go through it. So I was looking at this idea of social structures, who people are and what kind of places in the world they might have, and especially the ideas of privilege and status. Money's a big one, and there are lots more, so we could think about things like gender and ethnicity within that as well. Then I'm also thinking about practices, so the stuff that happens in sites like this and sites that are similar. What kind of pedagogical perspectives and bits of work are in place? What are the assumptions? How do we do this kind of facilitation work? Is it about interpretation on the floor? Is it about staffed interpretation? And what comes across from the contents, collections, and expertise that might be in these kinds of institutions? And, because we wouldn't want to stop there, right? I'm also thinking about social justice and political philosophy. So I'm thinking about how power works in these spaces, what recognition might look like, how we might think about representation and redistribution, and then back to identities, which takes us over again to the social structure stuff. So how people might see themselves and what they might do in those spaces. So another way of looking at that is like this. So these are the kinds of ways I break that down for practice. So I've written this bit out so that I'm super clear. So by infrastructure access, I mean things like, can people actually physically access these resources? So that might be like a physical access issue that we might think about in terms of ability, disability, but it might also be about how much free time they've got, how much money they've got, whether they know where these places are, whether they know how to get there, whether they feel like it's something that they've been marketed to. Have they any idea about what happens in these sorts of spaces? And then crucially, because this is based on a community learning framework that I've heavily adapted, do they have any power to shape what happens in those spaces? Can they shape the programming? Can they shape the exhibitions? Can they shape anything that happens there? Then literacies is another kind of multi-use term. So I'm thinking about the literal literacy, which you'll see from the participants that work with me. A lot of them could speak English, but not necessarily fluently read it, or read it and understand it at the same time as it was spoken to them and they were reading a thing at the same time. They also didn't necessarily have the science content or geography content or history content literacy that they needed, which is further complicated then when we see terminology creep into signage or different displays that makes it really hard if you already don't have some of that basic English grounding. And what we'll see from this is that in England particularly, and those of you who've come from other countries might laugh at this, we have one of the most monolingual kinds of interpretation. So if I go to other countries around the world, I spend my life taking pictures of their interpretation in 3 or 4 different languages, and come here and, there might be one sort of thing at the desk, at the reception desk, where there might be a bit of translation, but not all that much. So noticeably, my participants didn't find any other languages, which they thought was interesting. Also within literacies, I'm thinking about critical pedagogy. So do you know how to play the game? When you get in here, can you read an exhibition? Do you understand how to walk through it? When you have an interactive in front of you, do you know which button to hit? Is it at all sensible how you play that game, which might seem like it's aimed at kids, but be totally opaque to you? And then community acceptance, finally, is another kind of two-sided thing. So on the one hand, I'm thinking about people who felt they had no place here, that there was no relevance to them here, actually starting to accept that it might be useful, that it might have some benefit to them. But the flip side of that is that the insiders, the staff, the existing visitors, are they prepared to accept the changes that might need to happen to make spaces like this more equitable and more inclusive? And often that can be quite a tough struggle. So I hear quite a lot when I do various projects, the idea of, well, would we lose our core audience if we became more inclusive? And that seems to be a big fear that people have. So, having totally bamboozled you, the visits. So we went to 3 natural history sites and 1 science center. We're looking at 33 participants and different kinds of, lots of different kinds of standard ethnographic fieldwork techniques. And I'm going to concentrate on the 3 natural history museum settings. What I want to talk through first is a quick overview of the results, just to really get you feeling bleak at 2:10 in the afternoon. And this is the horrifying crux of the matter. So all these participants had, in the run-up to these visits, which they very kindly did anyway, felt like they wouldn't be something they'd be interested in. And we're kind of going, because by then I was their little weird research buddy, and they were doing me a favor. So when we got there, what was quite horrifying was how all of their negative expectations were met in practice by what they encountered. So in terms of infrastructure access, they did not already visit museums or similar sites. They didn't know where they were. They felt that they were really expensive, and they had no say in how they worked. And then when we got there, right enough, their expectations about expense were met. So one of the participants makes this horrible comment about how expensive everything in the shop was. So to buy her kid a rubber ball was just completely out of her price range, but really upsetting for the kid to not be able to do it. And they didn't know what to do when they got here. So in terms of infrastructure access, they were pretty inaccessible. In terms of literacies, like I just mentioned, they noted that there were no language translations. And one of the Somali women said, well, I wouldn't necessarily have expected to see my dialect, but I would have expected maybe a few of the international languages. And so she was saying, well, what about Arabic and French, just to give some sense of recognition that it might not just be everyone speaks English. They found the terms really hard to understand, so were frequently lost when they looked at exhibits. So most of the things they encountered they couldn't really use, which is quite upsetting, I think. And what was really apparent was they didn't know the rules of the game, and they talked afterwards about feeling uncomfortable, not knowing what they should do. And a couple of the elderly Sierra Leonean women were saying, well, we'd love to go back, but we'd need you to come back with us, or we'd need someone, just so that we could find the entrance and the exit, so that we could find the toilets. We don't know how these places work. Or I'd feel horribly lost and kind of disempowered coming back here. Not that they use the word disempowered. And then in terms of community acceptance, there was no one like us here. That was this sort of upsetting conclusion that one of the Latin American fathers voiced at the end. He said there were no staff or visitors or images that made them looked like them at all. They felt unwelcome and they felt unwanted. And that, I think, is quite a powerful message to take home. So I want to talk through two examples that I've talked about as community, being able to use your own resources to interact with something. And I'm pulling them out in this context because they really only had their own resources to draw on in order to have a meaningful learning experience. Because all of the stuff that was around them, they were blocked out from, they couldn't use. So in one sense, it's quite damning that we've got so few examples of it. But in another sense, I think these examples represent a lot of potential because natural history, certainly compared to the Science Center, provided many easier ways in for people to use their pre-existing knowledge and build on that. So the simple example, this is Maria from the Latin American group, and I'll just do her not Spanish accent voice. And she says, well, it's too weird. This is one of those bizarre family things. When I was this age in our bedroom, my sister had this fold-out butterfly collection that we caught in Colombia, with the pins in them. And I can remember it. It was one that folded out, and I can remember the wooden rectangle, and it was like that. And she's saying that in the context of a butterfly exhibition that she's visiting with her 4 daughters, the younger 2 that she's pointing out this to, they're about 12 and 8, and she's drawing on the fact that some of these butterflies were from Colombia, and that was huge for her because she was from Colombia, and there was nothing else there that she felt that connection to. But suddenly we find Colombian butterflies, and she's got all these stories about how they used to collect butterflies at home and is able to talk through her daughters what they did, what their auntie did, how they found these things, the gruesomeness of putting the pins in and chasing them around with these big nets, which is kind of, I find this sort of, I was quite charmed by the fact that this happened. The second one is more full-on and shows the limitations a little bit more. So this is probably the most striking example of this kind of meaning-making within the visits, and it happened with the Sierra Leonean group, members of whom twice danced and sang in contrast to some of the objects that they met in the museum. And what I'm going to argue is that through that dancing and singing, they were briefly able to disrupt their disempowered relationship with the museum to create connections between themselves, their cultural heritage, and the objects in front of them. So this is what they're saying, and I'll do all the voices, and you will have to remember I don't speak good Temni. So Hawa says, well, it's a song for that, and she's pointing at this, in this case, the bird, which is the second episode of dancing and singing. And Mama Kamara says, well, it's for these 2 birds, so when you sing and you go into society, people will eat for you, and she sings a bit of the song. She says, you know that cassava? And that's me going, yeah. She says, well, they boil it and they dry it, the cassava, and when it's dry, that's when we call it a kolopala. And Mama Sessi says, because it's stronger, so they've dried it to make it stronger. Mama Kamara says, well, we have to cook it and stew it before we eat it. And Mama Sese says, yeah, this one, pointing to the bird, this one, they dry it and then they boil it up with the cassava. And what they're telling me about is that seeing the birds prompts them to do the ceremonial dance for a rite of passage that's involved with the hunting and eating of these specific birds. And they do this through, this beautiful dance, lots of laughing and singing and talking, and they appear to enjoy themselves. And I feel like, because, much as I try not to, I still would love them to have had a great time. So there's a bit of bias. They're having a great time, and I feel like this is an interpretive strategy they've been able to scaffold on their own. And obviously there's no interpretation around this particular rite of passage and, the hunting and boiling and eating of this bird. It's more like the name of the bird and where the bird lives, which is, understandable. So, what I'm thinking about this example is that we can understand it as a form of transgression and resistance. So the rest of the museum, as they put it, it's got its objects imprisoned in glass, it's got these inaccessible texts, these unknown codes of conduct, and this incomprehensible language. But by dancing and singing, they can briefly disrupt this otherwise silent gallery with movement and noise, transforming their experience of inaccessibility and discomfort by reacting to an exhibit on their own terms. However, in the weeks that follow, it's not such a happy story, which perhaps is predictable. So I get emails later from Hawa and chats informally with them that they feel really stressed out and they regret the dancing and the singing. And in particular, they're worried about this idea of having seemed carried away. So they know that in doing this very different form of interpretation, this very different stuff, that it felt different, that it really exacerbated the difference between who they saw as these imagined visitors and the other visitors who were physically there, and themselves. And they felt that they had done the wrong thing. So it's really highlighting the difference between the kinds of audiences we do design for and the audiences that perhaps we don't. So what worries me is that these moments are, they're complex and they're not unproblematic. And they are trying to find a role for themselves, but that role is a real struggle. So to dork out for a minute, I'm looking at Bourdieu, and he reminds us that fitting in and reducing social distance is much easier for the dominant than the dominated. So for the Sierra Leoneans, the singing and the dancing represents a struggle to change, however briefly, their position as unknowledgeable and out of place in the museum, but it's not something they can maintain, and it's something that's very fragile. So if we look then as a conclusion, all four groups felt that these were places they weren't going to visit again. They didn't come away from these visits like, cool, informal science learning, this is something for me. I'm now going to go with all these places in London that are free. I'm going to go to all of them. That was not at all what happened. They just went, thanks very much, Emily, that was lovely, day out. Thanks so much for the lunch. You know, we'll never go back to these places again. So for me, this has quite a lot of resonance, and I'm coming to the end, so don't worry. So this was a really big deal for me, because it means that we have to be very careful before we can conclude that a thing worked when we're doing these kinds of design attempts. And we have to push against behavioral norms that we might be so used to that we accept them and don't see them, but that other people really struggle in, that really make other people feel out of place. And pushing against those behavioral norms came at a cost for the research participants, which on a social justice level is kind of horrifying. So let me be clearer. Visiting these spaces was detrimental to participants. It actually disadvantaged them. And I think we commonly make the opposite assumption, that even getting in the door would be somehow advantageous, that seeing these resources would be good. But that is not the case. Which to me means we have to be very careful when we design programs, especially those under diversity or inclusion banners, because we need to know something about who we're working with. And this is where I think a lot of the stuff from community learning about co-design becomes really valuable. So to hammer home a really horrifying quote from the social justice literature, this to me makes a lot of sense of the kinds of practices that my participants were encountering, and I'll read it out. So this is my favorite person in that world of literature, Iris Young, and she says, "Oppression also refers to systematic constraints on groups that are not necessarily the results of the intentions of a tyrant. Oppression is in this sense structural, rather than the result of a few people's choices or policies. Its causes are embedded in the unquestioned norms, habits, and symbols, in the assumptions underlying institutional rules and the collective consequences of following those rules." And I guess I'm suggesting that for our normal, imagined audiences that we might unreflexively think of, those rules aren't a problem. And for those people who aren't in that normal set of expected visitors whose expectations and behaviors and motivations we all write about and do evaluations with, these kinds of unquestioned norms and habits and symbols might be hugely problematic and make a really difficult space to enter into. So, conclusions, really brief. Conclusion 1, this exclusion was embedded in practice in ways that were really hard to there was no one fixed, simple solution. There was nothing that any of us could have done to have made that completely better. It was really kind of overdetermined in that sense. So all of the pre-existing expectations that these spaces were not for them were met for participants. One of the big conclusions for me is that we need to reimagine visitors. We need to really rethink what kinds of visitors we might want to cater for, and perhaps question the ways we cater for visitors and the assumptions we already have. And to me, that comes back then to this idea of unpicking the norms of professional practice, whether that's content, expertise, collections, facilitations, or audiences, and putting then equity at the heart of natural history museums. Final one, the implications for practice. I think we have a lot here to think about. So I think one thing is recognizing that museums are designed in ways that can exclude those who are outside this imagined visitor kind of thing that haunts a lot of these institutions. that inclusive informal science learning isn't simple, but it is a key issue for equity in science engagement and education. And I suppose the really mean question for me is, if we're not going to do natural history museums that can make these empowering and enjoyable experiences for everyone, well then what are we up to? That's kind of dreadful. And then I think this is the nicer way, to me, of thinking about improvements, is this idea of co-developing practices that build on knowledge about what does not work, but that also build on what does. And the idea of co-development there, I think, is quite nice, because I know from other projects, people have this fear of, well, we don't know and we can't solve all these problems. But I would suggest it's not so hard to go and work with people and find out what people need. So, should you really want to dork out later on, those are the 2 papers that this comes from. And I can send them to anyone that wants them, but they are both open access. And I think, thank you very much. Any questions? Totally on time. 5 minutes over.
So I suspect there hopefully will be a lot of questions after that presentation. Just at the back.
Could you show the previous screen again, just so I can take a picture of it? Thank you.
Any other questions for Emily?
Would Emily like a coffee?
We can make that happen. I think you've stunned the audience.
Have I
silent.
stupefied everyone? I'm sorry.
Go.
I think the lady in the pink hair had a question first.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Kat from the Natural History Museum.
Yeah.
Hello. I'm really interested in how people behave, and something that I've been fascinated with is these kind of culture hacks, where you go into a museum and you create very different kind of experiences than you would normally see in those spaces. Have you done any research on that kind of thing?
No.
Okay.
But yes, I've read about them and I love them. And I think some of them are cleverer than others. And I think some of them are more community-led than others. So where I get a bit huffy about them is if it's, say, me going in and redesigning a thing. I'm like, whatever. But like, if you got Mama Kamara and Mama Sese in there to redesign it, I'd be really excited to see what happened.
Okay, let's try it.
Any other? Dean up the back.
Hi, Emily. Dean from the Grant Museum.
Nice to meet you, Dean.
Nice to meet you, Dean. Emily. I just want a clarification on something. So you mentioned that, correct me if I'm wrong, but programs that are designed for an audience actually might disadvantage them in the long run. Is that
Yes.
right?
So I guess I'm getting at the idea of they might not, and that would be awesome, but I think we have to be really careful about what we design, building those kind of long-term trust-building relationships where we actually are working towards what people do want and what is relevant and what would be helpful. And I'm sort of have the revolution in my head is informal STEM learning to empower people, especially in the longer term, rather than just a one-off experience that does something and then they go away again. And I think what I was particularly shocked by was having worked in museums before and been doing science ed research for a while, I had gone in naively thinking I wasn't making their lives worse by asking them to do accompanied visits. And I think the outcome was that it was disadvantageous to them. They felt more out of place, they felt more unknowledgeable, they felt more unwanted, and that's not cool. That's the academic conclusion. It's not cool, guys.
We've got time for a few more. Sarah, just down the front.
Right. No, my question slightly builds on that, but also refers back to sort of the slide before last, and you had something about don't do, let's see here. Oh, yeah, that build on knowledge about what does not work, i.e. improve translation into multiple languages. Now, what I'm wondering about is kind of the idea of baby steps. Mm-hmm. So, for instance, how the Somali woman said, well, you know, I wouldn't expect my dialect, but maybe French and Arabic. You know, something that just says to me, you don't have to fit this image to be here. Yeah, and so, but it sounds like from there that you're saying, no, that actually doesn't work. And it is that it doesn't work, or that we shouldn't be complacent to think, oh, well, now we've done a couple translations, so now we welcome everybody, when in fact, that might help that particular, if some visitors, it might help a bit, but there's still so many embedded messages that it's for French and Arabic speakers who are actually quite educated. It's still not for people like you. You see what, I'm just curious what you think about baby steps in that sense.
I think that's a nice question, and I want to say a bit of both. I think, so what I mean by that is, so we know what does not work, i.e., and what's missing is we need improved translation into multiple languages. Like, that's pretty known. Like, my research is not the first to have found, like, hey, you know what really helps people understand something? Put it in their language. Like, revelate. I mean, that would be cool if I had discovered that. But, we know that. And, like, institutions like they do that already. It's just in the UK, we've got a really entrenched, weird, post-colonial, monolingual obsession going on, I would say. It's not something I've found in research. So I think there's a bit of both. So we already have some knowledge base, right? There is stuff out there. We should be using that. And I think we also need to think about how we might develop it. So I think part of the baby steps argument in the end of the Studies in the Science Ed paper, having cussed out small-scale projects for tokenism for like 30 pages, at the end I would firmly still argue that we need some small spaces for experimentation. We do need to figure out stuff. So it might be that, like Dean's suggesting, not quite, but we might want to try a program, watch it go wrong, try another one afterwards. These are things that are really worthwhile, I think. And although I do want the revolution, I accept the revolution's going to be hard to come by in a direct manner, and we might need to do some things on the way to get there. Does that help?
Yes.
So we're going to take 3 more questions. We've got Matt first, and then we'll take Andy down here, and then the person in the back. So, Matt.
Hi, Emily.
Hi, Matt.
Yeah, I think you could have an interesting conversation with David Cameron about the benefits of translation
I've got
and,
lots of things to
and
say.
integration. I guess my question, though, more related to this, is at an institutional level, how does that, what you're suggesting, how could that in practice work, given that you can't, I would suggest, in a city like London, which I just checked has got over 50 sort of different groups represented within it, that it's never an institution is going to struggle to speak to all of those groups individually, and it can't be a jack of all trades and end up potentially but not engaging anybody well, but just engaging lots of people in a sort of mediocre sense. So is it that it's not about the institutional level, but it's about small programs that do allow all communities to engage, or somewhere between those two? What could that look like?
I think there are a couple of easy wins, I think. So one example would be when I worked in a natural history museum of no obvious name, and we were looking at an exhibition around human fossil evidence in northern Eritrea, I want to say, and we were looking, and it was told as the fight between Leakey and the other guy, who I should remember the name of because I know him. Anyway, 2 white guys, and this whole story is a fight between 2 white guys. There's another way of telling that story, like that's very different and looks very different. So I think one way of thinking about that is in terms of just broadening up who we represent. And I think the Somali women's language point actually would speak to that point as well, because if we changed the kinds of names that we see in text, the kinds of people who are shown in photographs, and the kinds of stories that are told, so that they're not so overwhelmingly, in our country, Eurocentric and white-looking. Some might also say male and heterosexual, if you look at some of those other bits of research. So in a way, making a bit of space for the recognition of difference, I think, goes a long way and might go further than we think. At the institutional level, languages, I think we could pick a couple. That would be a good starting point. I think if you imagine there is an ecosystem argument to that question. So it might not be that one institution has to do everything, but across the spectrum of different resources, we do work with everyone. And of course, what we know from that welcome review is that's a really nice idea, but the spectrum currently all cater for the one dominant group. So that's not working right now. And how we would get that to change or incentivize it to change, I'm not quite sure. But I would love to talk to Dave about it.
Let's go down to Andy.
Hi, Emily. I've probably got an unfair question, given you weren't here this morning, but there was a
tired.
discussion earlier about institutions taking more of an editorial stance or a campaigning stance on some of the wicked problem questions. And I wonder whether there could be a tension between that and being welcoming to multiple and diverse audiences.
Unless your stance was, we want to be inclusive, in which case I'm all for it. I think from the research in this project, participants saw these kinds of places as having a strong authoritative voice already. I don't think they saw them as unbiased places of calm and beautiful world-benefiting knowledge. So I think they said things to me like, it's, Eurocentric was a word participants used, and it's all about white men was another one. And I had some nurses in one group complaining that, all this Florence Nightingale, where's Mary Seacole? So I think they already see these spaces as heavily opinionated, heavily invested in the authority and power of certain groups and not others. So in a sense, I'm not sure adding a strong climate change message would make a huge difference. I don't think that would be the straw that broke the camel's back in that sense.
So we've got one more question. It was somewhere in the deep, dark back of the theatre.
My question is basically coming from an education background. And when you have a group that you know might not be familiar with museums, you kind of prepare them, you walk them through the visit, and you have all that kind of pre-stuff. How could we adapt that to work with different groups to kind of improve that cultural literacy walking in the door to make it a welcoming space?
Yeah, so that for me is a classic example of things we already know how to do and just need to do more of or keep doing or something. So these groups, I had a chat with them and they'd ask me lots of questions and they picked the spaces. But the problem was the overwhelmingness. So 2 of the visits were to a really big natural history museum and 2 were to a much smaller natural history site that had collections as well as live, so dead and live collections to make the distinction. I don't know if Sarah approves of that distinction. But the smaller one was a little bit more comfortable, but was the one where the elderly Sierra Leonean women came back and said, we can't go in there again, we can't find the toilet. So this idea, I think, is really valuable, and I know that in enterprising science, which is another project a bunch of us here work on, we've looked really a lot at how to make these like welcoming spaces where you would be able to kind of give people a sense of the rules of the game, like how best to deal with this space. You don't want to walk through every gallery, you'll be knackered. Like, here are the cafes, you want to pick a couple of things, then you want to sit down. You probably don't want to be here for more than 2 hours, or you'll get that horrible museum fatigue that we might know about, but they might not. So I think that stuff's all really valuable, and I think, again, if you're looking at different kinds of groups, it's worth thinking about what you can find out about them in advance, if you can ask them what their interests are, if you can ask them why it is they want to come, and then providing anything specific that they need. So one of the things that all of the groups complained about was the food. Where we have dead food was the Colombian complaint. The Asian group were all Hindus, so eating vegetarian food, and they just point blank refused to eat anything. But because we had been doing a bit of pre-planning, we'd been able to get us a community room lunch space booked. So they just came and had a big picnic, and that was the highlight of the day for them, which is upsetting in a way for that museum, but at the same time, that bit of provision went a long way to making them feel a bit more welcome. So I think there's a lot of that stuff we can do, and I think that's the stuff that does the long-term relationship building, or helps to. Cool.
I'm going to stop it there. Should we give Emily one more thanks for that fantastic presentation?